Donc nous ouvrons cette première séance de notre deuxième journée.
We'll get started with our first session of our second day of our meeting by looking at an issue which can be a bit dry, governance, but space programs which are sometimes owned by the European Union and sometimes have a more hybrid ownership. And if you then look at the projects that the EU is trying to put in place for the future, then of course you do need a common understanding of governance. You need to find a way to make decisions and manage those programs and projects in a proper way. Now, to keep to our timing and to make sure that the second session can get started on time, we'll try and organize things properly. Now, one of our speakers will have to leave before the end of our session, the Minister, who we welcome, because she has other commitments to get on with, which we of course understand and appreciate. But I'll give the floor to Mr. Remek. He'll have an opportunity to speak, and then we'll hear from the Minister. Because you were in the chair for space issues last year, and you've now returned to us, and you can let us know what kind of progress has been made. But Mr. Remek, you have the floor. Just say a few words, then we'll hear from Mrs. Laruelle, and then we can get started with the speaker list.
Very much. Good morning. It looks like that anybody or somebody from us was missing in action. But welcome everybody who has came. Nyní mi dovolte přejít na...
Peut-être dire que pour entendre M. Remek en anglais, c'est la cabine.
If you want to listen to Mr. Remek in English, you'll have to tune into channel 2.
Přejít na češtinu a také...
I'll speak Czech. Once again, let me welcome Sabine Laruelle, the Minister from the Belgian government. It's good to see you here. Ladies and gentlemen, this sixth plenary session of the conference, as has already been said, will look at infrastructure's governance, and that's not a straightforward issue. The way in which the activities linked to space are organized is of importance to our citizens, of course, and a point made yesterday as well. And we are not the ones that need to be convinced of how important projects such as Galileo and GMES are. It's our day-to-day work, but of course we need to make sure that the interest is made clear to the citizens as well, and we heard from Nereus yesterday about that as well. But of course we need to pull together and do things together, and that's the only way to do it. That applies to the space policy programs, and I myself became convinced of that years ago when I was working as a cosmonaut, an astronaut. But of course, the member states, the EU and its institutions are faced with a challenge. It's as if we're all driving a car. The first person is actually holding the steering wheel, someone's pressing the accelerator, and then the other's got his foot over the brake, and that's what we all seem to be doing. So we seem to be moving forward, but we could make swifter progress, really, if we all pull together, and that would allow us to have an advantage over our competitors. You have the US, Russia, China, India, and they're all competitors, of course, and they're more operational. They've got one driver, really, one centre taking all of the decisions, and that's something that we need to move towards. We need to make sure that we can further our own interests and our own economic strength and independence. And of course all of this also needs to be done for the interest of our citizens. Now, for GMES and Galileo, we've been trying to come up with infrastructure governance, but the same applies to the energy sector. And the infrastructure governance will, to a large extent, determine how we take GMES and Galileo from here. Now, of course, you also need to make sure that the necessary funding is in place, because otherwise these ambitious projects have no future. So we need to look at the financing methods as well. We need to look at whether the money comes from the EU budget or whether we need to look at other types of financing, which is something which is currently being discussed. Now, some fear that GMES will not be part of the multi-annual financial framework. And the problem there being that if you then look for solutions at a national level, people might start hiding behind the crisis which we have in Europe. So we need common solutions to these issues, and we need a common approach to the use of resources, and that will yield benefits for everyone in Europe. Now, yesterday at the conference, the point was made that there aren't very many areas where Europe truly is a leader on an issue, and the space area is one of those areas where we are clear leaders, and it would be a pity to lose that position. Now, the problem is that sometimes changes are made throughout the life cycle of a project. It's as if you're on a ski run, you're coming down as a skier, but people then keep moving the little gates that you have to ski past. It's as if they keep moving the goalposts. And that's something that we need to look at. There's EUMETSAT as a project. That works well, so we do have some examples that we can draw on. And I don't have any clear, comprehensive answer to what we should do on infrastructure governance. I'd simply point out that there are issues that have to be resolved. I'd like to listen to other speakers, of course, and I'm sure that they will give us important contributions from the national point of view and also from the institutional point of view. Thank you.
Monsieur le Vice-président, merci. Et donc, si Madame Laruelle veut bien prendre...
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'll now give the floor to Mrs. Laruelle.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Now, talking about space policy, economic spin-offs, daily spin-offs for the citizen, is something that gives me great pleasure to speak about as Minister in charge of scientific policy, especially as space issues were a priority for the Belgian presidency. And since the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty, there have been more and more meetings about this. Texts have been rewritten, but nevertheless, I feel that certain discussions have perhaps overtaken the importance of taking decisions. Europe needs texts, it's true, and consensus, but it also needs action, specific action, progress, and the space policy is no exception. From an institutional point of view, the Lisbon Treaty provided a legal base which was lacking to establish a true space policy within the European Union. It's true that implementing this legal base gives rise to discussions, often difficult ones, and I understand that. It's important to see how the tasks are divided up between the Union, Member States and ESA for the governance of European space activities. It's now time to take decisions. It's time to decide on the new governance for space in Europe, a balanced governance which respects the roles, the competence and the experience of all the players involved. You all know that it is an important priority for European space policy, but even more for the credibility of the Union. We know that space activities are an area that brings forth innovation, economic growth, creates jobs. It's strategic in the quest for European competitiveness. The Commission should be ambitious, and this ambition has to go beyond words and statements and declarations, and that means that adequate financing has to be provided through an effective public policy. And we should be the driving force for our industry, for the SMEs, to enable them to continue developing high quality products and to allow them to strengthen their competitiveness and to allow them to conquer new markets and create employment. In the area of space, the challenges facing Europe are huge. How can we make budgetary resources available in line with the new competence provided for in the treaties? How can we maintain and develop our competence in the face of emerging countries? And these are things that are being discussed, but we have to make progress on space and provide this policy with the resources and means that it needs. The rules of financing must take into account the specific nature of space programs, which are, of course, high-risk activities, but also long-term activities. Belgium is the 5th largest contributor to ESA, and will be extremely vigilant considering the distribution of roles and financial resources, the juste retour principle. It's absolutely important to ensure that competence and infrastructure is balanced, to use national resources as efficiently as possible and see that competition ensures value for money. We have to see that people are supported in their freedom to undertake new activities. This balance is very fragile, but it is very important. I'd also like to point out, even though you've probably heard this often enough, that one of the major priorities for Europe is the deployment of the Galileo constellation. The European Union must do its utmost to succeed here and within the limits of our budgetary constraints. The second flagship program of the EU, GMES, must be continued, and we must ensure that what the 40 members of the European Parliament have requested be taken into account in the financial framework. And all this constitutes an important step in the future financing of our space policy. I'd like to stress the need for setting up instruments and mechanisms for the financing in the European Union that are suited and able to take into account the specific nature of the space sector. We need these instruments and mechanisms, and they have to ensure that there is a balanced involvement of European capacity, while at the same time involving all the member states of the EU and ESA. Ladies and gentlemen, it is quite clear that we have to work together to convince and offer a solid and lasting support to our European space program so that Europe can remain a leader in the world. It's within all our interests to ensure that we finalize our discussions on this with regard to space governance. Our hesitations, our national interests should not be a stumbling block, and we have to take decisions and ensure that we have the instruments that allow our companies to innovate and create jobs. And they should have the rules that they need, but particularly allow for our citizens to benefit to a maximum of the public investment in space.
Merci. Merci, Madame la Ministre.
Thank you, Madam Minister. We've now heard from a member state through you. We'll now give the floor to a second speaker, the European Commission, represented by Mr. Weissenberg. Now, you've heard Mr. Weissenberg. The Commission needs to continue to be ambitious, but needs to move from making statements to concrete actions. Now, on financing, we'll have discussions later on. I'm sure that will be a lively discussion. But when it comes to governance, how do you, in the Commission, see things 1 year on from our last discussions?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. If you allow me, let me start with a word of gratitude, because gratitude is a disappearing quality nowadays, to the audience, to the participants, and to you, Mark and Joël. Since a couple of years, I sense a growing interest in space. Not only a growing interest, but I sense a convergence in space between all actors. Last year, I remember, Minister, we talked about the famous triangle: Council, Parliament, European Commission. There is another one, ESA, Member States, agencies. And I'm grateful that this growing interest materializes more and more. And I think this is thanks to you, Marc and Joël. You have created bridges. And this event is an event which takes place once a year. And this is the Space Autumn event in 2011, so I'm grateful for this initiative. You have asked me to elaborate a little bit on infrastructure governance. Let me start with the word infrastructure. If you ask somebody on the street what is an infrastructure, he will tell you it's the TGV between Paris and Brussels. A German may add is the new gas pipeline between Russia and Eastern Germany. The Brits would say it's Heathrow Airport. So this is natural, it comes up to your mind, infrastructure on Earth. It's not obvious that space is considered in the perception of people as an infrastructure. And I think it's high time that we get the message across. There is a space infrastructure as important as an infrastructure on Earth. And I would even add, it's not only an infrastructure, it's a critical infrastructure. The Union has a directive on critical infrastructures, and it is time that this directive covers the space infrastructure as well. Regarding the governance, again, governance is a beautiful word. In German, we don't even have a corresponding formulation for governance. The French have it, la gouvernance. If you say gouvernance in German, it doesn't help us a lot. So I understand governance means the way how we organize ourselves in space. This is the famous debate in the institutional triangle. If we talk about governance for infrastructures, I assume we are talking about optimizing the use of space infrastructures. Who does what, not just in building up the infrastructure, especially in exploiting the infrastructure. And if this is the right starting point, then the first answer is there is not one size fits all. The response will be a tailor-made one depending on the infrastructure. You cannot compare the Galileo infrastructure to the GMES infrastructure. You cannot compare the GMES infrastructure to space situational awareness. So we have to differentiate. This would be my first message. Let's talk a little bit about Galileo infrastructure. We are happy to see that the deployment phase is accelerating. We have launched the 2 satellites the 21st of October, and I'm under instruction from my political authorities to accelerate the next deployment. We are going to order new satellites, hoping that we can sign the next contract the 1st of February. Now, at the same time, we are preparing what we call the governance of Galileo. Of course, Galileo is a space project, but for the Commission, more important are the services. Galileo needs to deliver a service. GMES needs to deliver a service. So what we have in mind for Galileo is the European Commission is now the program manager. We are managing the deployment phase. The European Commission cannot continue to be the operator of Galileo. Inside an administration of the European Commission, we cannot manage Galileo in the exploitation phase. So the question is, who can do it? And according to our proposal, which is now in discussion inside the Commission services, we propose to look first into the family European Union. Do we have existing entities related to space activities inside the European Union able to do such a business? And there is one entity in the European Union which has been created by Parliament and Council some years ago, called the GSA. The Executive Director, Carlo De Dorit, is with us today. And we think it is worthwhile to reflect if in the future the GSA is not the right entity of the European Union to work like a holding for the exploitation of Galileo. Of course, this does include the possibility to delegate a lot of activities from GSA to other entities. For GMES, it's much more complicated. GMES is a partnership with member states. This infrastructure does not belong to the European Union. For Galileo and EGNOS, the Union is owner. So it's more complicated, but it's more fascinating at the same time. What we have in mind is, irrespective of the financing debate, that we continue GMES as an exercise which is highly decentralized. GMES is not just a space project, it's a combination between in situ and space. And again, let's look into existing entities before we create new ones. And we have entities with a high reputation. The European Environment Agency in Copenhagen for in situ. We have EUMETSAT in Darmstadt, able and willing to run the services for atmosphere and oceanography. And we have some other entities. Of course, ESA continues to be our procurement agent. So for GMES, our idea is decentralized, a light holding inside the European Commission, and a network with member states. Time has come that we ask member states not simply for a partnership. Member states have space assets, hardware. And if we do it intelligently, we can integrate the space assets of member states into such a governance project. Last point, space situational awareness. We are not talking much about it. We are focused on Galileo and GMES. But if we consider Galileo and GMES as a space infrastructure, like a highway or a TGV, we have to have the courage to say, if we build something, we need to be sure that we are able to maintain it. And the maintenance of Galileo and the maintenance of GMES means we have to protect this critical infrastructure. That's what space situational awareness is about. And following the instructions we received from ministers in the different space councils, we are working on this chantier number 3. And this is a test case of partnership, because you are aware that member states have assets, not we, the Commission, the European Union. SSA is building on existing capabilities existing in some member states. And it's not a secret that these assets are military assets in some member states. And the big news, and I'm very happy to say so, is that the military people told us there will only be one SSA, a dual civil and military one. This is a major progress for the European Union. So my plea would be for SSA, dear member states, help us to integrate your assets in a network managed like a holding again on the level of the European Union. So this, in a nutshell, Chairman, is what I wanted to say on governance and infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Eisenberg. Vous avez effectivement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weissenberg. You have now clarified quite a lot of matters for us. Now, the Minister will have to leave soon. Could I just ask you for an off-the-cuff reaction to what the Commission has said just before you leave, and how do you see the situation then?
Je peux évidemment partager.
Well, by and large, I share what Mr. Weissenberg has said on behalf of the Commission. Mr. Weissenberg is right in saying that there are 3 tripods that have to be put in place. There's the relations between the Commission, the Council and the European Parliament, and then the relations between the Commission, the ESA and the Member States. And again, I agree with Mr. Weissenberg, a political decision now needs to be taken. The Member States need to make progress, and they can't just put the ball back in the court of the Commission and say, take care of it. That's why I keep talking about the European Union, and by union I mean that everyone needs to pull in the right direction. Member States need to become active, and they need to understand that they need to cede some of their national prerogatives. In my introduction, I did also say that the European space policy needs to be given the necessary means and resources. I wasn't criticizing the Commission for not doing that enough. No. The Parliament and Council, where the Member States are represented, will also have to chip in. But now it is time to take a decision with Council, Parliament and the Commission to allow us to make progress. Thank you. Of course, if you want to return, you'd be most welcome to return at any time. I'll now give the floor to our third speaker, the first person to speak on behalf of the national agencies. Mr. Werner, could you take the floor first, so we can hear from you on behalf of Germany? Thank you.
Dear honourable members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, in the following I would like to concentrate my remarks related to governance issues on Galileo, GMES and SSA as Mr. Weissenberg. Let me start with the first so-called flagship programs, Galileo, as this program features the simplest construction of the 3, simply on the grounds that independent satellite-based navigation started in Europe with Galileo, and that such a system is based on satellites and ground stations of one kind. In absence of existing national and European capacities, an approach involving, in essence, full funding on European level was possible, significantly simplifying governance. Still, the present governance scheme needs some modifications overhaul, as it was put in place in an ad hoc decision in the aftermath of the failure of the PPP model with industry. Therefore, in the next phase of the program, which I assume to be fully funded by the EU, the following adjustments to the present governance scheme should be made. The Commission, as a political institution, should, as far as possible, retreat from its present function as programme manager and concentrate its action on political supervision, strategy, international representation and funding. Accordingly, the portfolio of the GSA should be extended, including in particular the contract management related to operations and exploitation of Galileo and EGNOS. ESA should continue to be responsible for contract management related to the deployment of the system and next-generation development activities. ESA's role as system prime should be reflected upon in the long term. However, because of the size and the uniqueness of Galileo, an industrial solution should only be chosen if it does not imply the danger of undesired monopolization. So some of the presented adjustments are quite significant. I do not have the impression that they will give rise to a controversial debate. I am therefore confident that before end of 2013, decisions will be taken in essence along the above lines. The situation appears to be much more difficult with regard to GMES, and not only because the Commission so far has declined to propose any funding from the EU budget for the timeframe 2014 and 2020. As a personal comment, I would like to point out that all explanations of the EC concerning the actual budget situation are not convincing to me. However, GMES is more complex than Galileo because satellite-based remote sensing did not start in Europe with the launch of the GMES initiative. Furthermore, GMES technically requires a variety of different satellites, constellations and additional data sources. Therefore, right from the beginning, existing national and commercial satellites and satellite constellations had to be taken into account in order to avoid unnecessary duplications. Accordingly, the capabilities of the Sentinel satellites were decided on the basis of a gap analysis related to the existing national and commercial Earth observation satellite systems, the so-called contributing missions. Recalling that the GMES regulation defines GMES as an initiative providing 6 main services, namely atmosphere monitoring, climate change monitoring, marine environment monitoring, land monitoring, emergency management and security, we see that a substantial part of the GMES services, in particular emergency management and security, but also part of the service land monitoring, for example urban planning, depend critically on the data of the contributing mission. Those data will have to be procured by the EU, in general via competitive tenders for framework contracts. However, these competitive tenders have to be regarded as being very sensitive, since they will involve not only competitions between different national public systems, but also between public and commercial systems. In view of the fact that the EU procurement rules do not provide countermeasures against monopolisation concentration, such procurements have to be organised in a very well and intelligently prepared way in order to secure fairness and to avoid a disencouragement of private investments by public funds. Despite the critical dependence of GMES services on the data of contributing missions, and with the Eurocrise increasing need for the public side to foster commercialisation also in space segment, wherever possible, so far no concept paper on data procurement and data pricing has been elaborated, so I have to positively mention pilot data procurements executed by ESA for pilot projects in the context of FP7. Equally worrying is the fact that almost 5 years after the first request of the EU Council for a GMES data and information policy, we still do not have such a proposal which could finally make the GMES regulation and therefore secure GMES operationally. We also should not forget that the GMES data and information policy is the main instrument to develop and foster the downstream market. Apart from those two substantial differences between GMES and Galileo, my earlier remarks on governance made in the context of Galileo do basically also hold for GMES, where I assume, simply on the grounds of the undeniable communitarian character of GMES, that GMES, like Galileo, will beyond 2013 in essence also be funded by the EU. Hence, the Commission should concentrate its action on political supervision, strategy, international representation and funding. Contract management related to the GMES services should, as also proposed by the Commission, be delegated to EU agencies competent in the fields of environment and security, or to other competent and specialised European agencies like EUMETSAT. ESA should again continue to be responsible for contract management related to the deployment of the Sentinels and related to next generation development activities, where on the grounds of the difficulties on the EU side we have a tendency that the next generation development activities might be even funded by ESA. Before I come to my closing remarks, just allow me some words on SSA. Here the situation is very similar to GMES. So in the absence of substantial European core capacities, the need to make maximum use of existing capacity is even larger. On the other hand, the procurement issue appears to be somewhat easier to tackle as relevant commercial capacities do not exist, but data policy certainly has a distinctively more pronounced security dimension. In conclusion, and apart from the GMES funding issue, on which I remain demanding but optimistic, as the communitarian character of GMES forbids a GMES outside of the multiannual financial framework, I believe that the main challenges ahead are not so much related to an efficient distribution of responsibilities between the European institutions and agencies, but rather related to the needs of developing resilient data policies as well as procurement and pricing schemes in order to achieve the necessary utilisation of all existing capacities in Europe. As the chairman of the executive board of the German Aerospace Center, I can assure you that we are prepared to make our contribution in the dedicated fora in order to help resolving those issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Madame la Ministre, bon retour. Et encore merci.
Thank you once again, Minister, for coming along. I'll now give the floor to Mr. Duquesne, who is representing the French body, the CNES. Could I just remind you that you have 5 minutes so that afterwards we also have some time for a discussion. Thank you very much, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. In relation to governance and infrastructure's governance, I'd like to start off by recalling that there are three main actors when it comes to the space policy. There's the EU, the space agencies, and the member states. Those are the three pillars. They each have their own policy in place, their own budget, and their own programs. Now, the member states, of course, have decisions to take within ESA and within the European Union institutions, but they also have their own capacity, whether it's on land or in orbit. They have industrial capacity, research capacity, and all of that capacity needs to be taken into account to define the European space policy and implement that. And I think that Europe will benefit most from a space policy in Europe if we properly use all of the capacity which is available across the ESA, the member states, and the EU. So what is important, and of paramount importance actually, for our governance is to bring together all of those capacities and to have some kind of coordination mechanism which will allow Europe to use all of the means available in the most efficient way. So we would avoid any overlap, any duplication of effort, and we'd also have to make sure that there are no shortcomings in certain areas. Now, under the Lisbon Treaty, this role of coordination has been given to the EU. So now there is this triangle, these three actors, and we'll need to make sure that they can work together properly. We need to make sure that the European Space Agency can work together with the other institutions, but also with the member states. As part of that governance, I think that the European Union has an important role to play in terms of setting out the policy, the strategy. The European Space Agency and the member states would be more involved with research and development, programming, innovation, and developing space infrastructure. When you look at community space infrastructure, then the European Union has a major role to play there. They are there to provide steer to the program, and they need to put in place a governance structure which allows them to fully shoulder their responsibility and to fully play their political role, to give guidance to a program, provide input to a program, and to make sure that the program meets the public needs and interests, the citizens' needs and interests, and it would also have to federate over the users' needs. They'd have to make sure that the necessary data and services are in place, which is of course important to make sure that we use our space infrastructure properly. And of course the EU is also responsible for mobilizing the necessary funds. And in addition to that, they would also have to coordinate the various actors in Europe. If you look at Galileo, for example, and if you look at governance for that program, then it's fair to say that the EU has played its role to the full. They've taken important decisions which has allowed the program to continue, even though the program had serious problems at some point. They've put in place structures to develop space infrastructure. they put in place governance which allowed us to move to the operational stage, and the conclusion we draw from that is that if the EU plays its role to the full, it can provide real added value, as it did for Galileo. I'd go on to say that the EU could probably strengthen its supervisory capacity further. It could draw on the expertise held by the European Space Agency, the national space agencies, but also the intergovernmental structures such as the EUMETSAT and so on. The European Union would then delegate technical coordination of the space component to the European Space Agency along the lines of how they did things before in other areas. They could also draw on the competence and capacity which the national space agencies have, and that would be similar to what the European Space Agency does under its compulsory scientific program, where missions are piloted by the European Space Agency, but where the instruments and tools are actually provided by the member states. So programs could be shared between the ESA and the member states. GMES, for example, would be a good example of that. That's not just a new infrastructure that needs to be developed, but you're also looking about in situ networks and support that needs to be given by member states or by intergovernmental agencies. And a further example would be SSA, which was the example given by Mr. Paul Weissenberg. So we need strong governance. The EU needs to take the lead. They need to shoulder their responsibility. And the French Space Agency is, of course, willing to provide any support they can to make sure that these programs and infrastructures can be developed properly. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Zucker. Il ressort au fond de ce que l'on entend que le maître mot, c'est à chaque fois coordination.
Well, obviously the key is coordination to all this. And coordination of a European programme seems to be self-evident, but from a Commission point of view, but it might actually be more complicated in practice. If we consider all the different agencies here and those being created, there is also possibly a political problem in terms of who takes the initiative and also for activities and financing, but we'll come back to that. I'd now like to ask Mr. De Lazo to tell us about the Italian situation.
Grazie Presidente.
Thank you. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about space governance. It's something that is very important and indeed very urgent, because we've seen that with the launch of Galileo, we've moved into a new stage. And GMES is also moving towards its operational activities, following up on the regulation approved last year and the launch of the first Sentinel. As many have already said, we are starting from scratch, although not really, because if you go back to 1970, the European Space Agency was set up and certain mechanisms and procedures were put in place for governance in order to implement programs. And this was something that was appreciated by everyone, including world leaders. So we have already started on this path, but things have changed over the years. And also the initiatives of the by the European institutions, the flagship programs, Galileo and GMES, but also with regard to governance, with the framework agreement in 2003, which regulated the mechanisms for interaction between ESA and the European Union. And with this framework agreement, the Space Council was set up, which is the Competitiveness Council and the ESA Council together. And that is also part of governance in a certain sense. A joint secretariat was set up for ESA and the Commission, and a high-level group for space policy was set up. So this is the backdrop. This is what we already have. And we support the decisions by the May Competitiveness Council, which points out that space governance should be based on 3 pillars: the European one, the European Space Agency, and member states. And it's on that basis that we have to work, because if we can pool these efforts, then we can all work together towards better governance in the future. And many have referred to this already. So we feel that we need to have a strong link between the European Union and the European Space Agency, and this relationship could be based on the framework agreement signed in 2003 and that has been extended recently, looking at the specific competence on each side. ESA, we feel, should maintain its status as an intergovernmental agency and have its own independence, because it's with this setup that the interests, both technologically and also in terms of investments, that member states in ESA would be encouraged to invest in space technology and set the foundations for what we have today. So we feel that this is a mechanism that should be continued. In ESA, in the programs, there's this principle of geographical return, and we feel that that should be maintained. And for the European programs as such, those that are set up and financed by the European Union, such as Galileo, and we do hope for GMES and others in the future, in such a case, we feel that ESA should continue to make this contribution of technology to the programs, and we also know what arises from the treaties, what its role is, and they have a certain surveillance and monitoring role. So this is the approach which we feel should be pursued. As regards the European programs, for ESA, it's important to have this juste retour, whereas for the European side, we need to have an industrial policy, taking into account the specific nature of the space dimension. And we need to have broad participation, but balanced with the member states, the governments and agencies. So governments that want to get involved can. If we consider for a moment the details of governance, well, for Galileo, we do support the idea that political supervision of the programme should be done by the European Commission, since it's a European programme. But we also support the idea, as the Commission has mentioned, that both the agency wants to be a type of program manager for GMES. And obviously the details of this still have to be worked out. How all this should fit together, and bearing in mind the different roles, the distribution of roles, especially for the public integrated services. So it's very complex, and particularly if you look at infrastructure, because it's the member states that provide the infrastructure, and there's also an important services component, and this could affect governance as well. Also think of security. So we feel that the governance of GMES should be examined so that it makes participation possible, both the European institutions and the national authorities, the networking approach, but it has to be defined as a whole, because there's a link between infrastructure and services and Justratur and services. So that would be my conclusion then, and back to the chairman.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Licotier. Je suis désolé de faire un peu la police pour le...
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Williams, I'll give you the floor now. You're a newcomer of sorts, because you went there last year. So we very much welcome the UK Space Agency, and with a great deal of interest we'll now listen to your views.
Thank you for inviting me today.
You have to push on the button.
Oh, you have to push on. Sorry about that. Technology again. The Commission have helped me out with the button. Thank you for inviting me today, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think when I listen to the discussions, I think we're all in great danger of agreeing on what we need to do, and I'm sure Confucius would have a great problem with our position that Europe seems to spend half its time broadly agreeing on where it should go in policy and what programmes it should have, and then the other half of its time disagreeing on how we should implement and govern those programmes that we should have. And it's always an interesting debate that we have across the table. But I think that one of the reasons for that is that defining the policy and the programmes is actually a different set of governance issues than implementing the programmes. And I think what we spent a lot of time on in the last 10 to 15 years is about what programmes we should have in Galileo and GMES. And as I look around this room, I can see some people who've been involved since the mid-90s, late 90s, some who've retired, some who've moved on. But it's an interesting that for GMES it's been going on since about 1998, and we've had that debate about what GMES should look like, and now we are actually beginning to move to implementing it in a real operational way. And the second point really for me is that while we talk about governance in Europe, we should recognise that Europe has a lot of success behind it. I mean, ESA is, with all the problems it's had and will have, a successful organisation. And EUMETSAT is and will be a successful organisation. And at member state level, there are a lot of successful space programmes underway. So we have, in the last 30 years in Europe, developed a real capability in space, and a capability we should all be proud of. And what we're really talking about today is the introduction of a new big player into the game of operations, and that's the European Union in the face of the Commission. Because even in the Commission, under Framework 7 and predecessors, there has been a successful element of space research going on. So I think It's not all about new things, it's all about building on where we are. What we have to do with Galileo and GMES is implement properly, and I think there, I never fail to be amazed by how public organisations manage to not to recognise the importance of transferring accountability and responsibility to an organisation. I think the EU and other speakers have said it should stay out of the programme management in the future. But if it's to transfer that responsibility to whatever entity it transfers it to, it must have a clear statement of what it wants to receive back, which is measurable, so that when it spends the money, it knows the money's been spent on what it wanted it to be spent on. And organisations know that the data streams will exist and they can use them in the form they're supposed to be. That sounds very simple and easy, and it's actually probably easier than it looks for Galileo. I'm not quite sure it's so easy for GMES, but it does mean that the Union, in the face of the Commission, have really got to sit down and define in simple terms, if they are going to give the operational responsibility to the GSA, what they actually want to deliver for each of the services, and to do the same for GMES. And if you do that, then you can actually transfer the responsibility to deliver, you can transfer the accountability to deliver, and then you can measure whether it is being delivered at a sensible timescale through what I would call an independent assessment of that capability. And then you have what I call the good cycle of, yes, we're doing what we said we would do, we're measuring it, and it is what we said we would do, and the world at large is happy with what we are doing. And I think if that's not put in place across both Galileo and GMES, and either as a single entity in the case of Galileo, and perhaps in the case of GMES, a series of different entities, a series of different agreements with separate entities, then I think we will have a long-term problem on governance in Europe on these two big programmes. I think the other area two other areas I think are going to be important in the future, and I'll be brief on them. One is security, and I think that has been mentioned in the guise of space situational awareness. I think there we have to recognise that space is not just an asset that could be used in the open domain, but it's an asset that's used in the military domain. It's an asset that has a clear critical infrastructure process behind it, and in the UK at the moment we are undertaking a national security for space review, which will report next May, and hopefully feed into the Commission thinking, because we are beginning to realise in the UK that many of the activities of UK organisations, from banks to road networks to the military to public services, are at some point in that system dependent on space as a service provider as part of that infrastructure. And we need to make sure we understand that, get it right, and play it into the game. And that will bring new challenges, particularly to ESA and the EU, in the way they manage the security aspect of programmes. And we shouldn't underestimate that. It is a different world. It's a world that I've got used to, and it's a world that the EU in particular, and the Commission in particular, will need to get used to. We have to have confidence that what is happening is being done in a secure world when necessary. And the other one, which really relates to the class of service being operated, is on what I would call liability. One of the issues with both Galileo and GMES is they are operational services. They will operate 24/7, as it's called in the trade. They will provide guaranteed services. And therefore the question of who is liable if it is wrong will arise at some stage. I think if we look at GPS today and the way it is used for road navigation, nobody's ever challenged that, but that's probably because on GPS they do not guarantee it to within 200 metres. If within Galileo we're going to provide commercial services with a guaranteed level of service, if we're going to provide safety of life services with a guaranteed level of service, is that any different than when you plug electrical equipment into a socket and you expect 240 volts and 13 or 2 amps to come out at 50 hertz or 60 hertz? And if it doesn't, you sue the electric company. If you turn the tap on, you expect clean water. You turn the gas on, you expect the gas to come out as ordered. And I think there is a domain in operational services that we haven't yet risen to, and we need to in the next few years, about guaranteeing the quality, about monitoring the quality, and about who is responsible if something goes wrong because the service offered was not the service that they said they were offering. And I leave that. That's an important point, I think, and a very important point. The second point final point I will make then is that One of the roles of the Commission, I think, is to build this public confidence, and it's a role of Member States, and we can work together. I think we have to make people more aware of what space is about and why the infrastructure is invisible but important, and ensure that they understand its role in their lives and its potential role in their future lives. So that as we go forward, we will get the public backing that to some extent we lack today. I'm conscious that certainly in the UK and in Europe to a great extent, space is still seen as something that scientists do when they go to Mars, and is not yet seen enough as something that you use to do your daily life. And I think we've got to continue to transform that understanding in the public eye as we go forward. So, Chairman, with my final point is, as we look at the governance of Galileo and GMES, what we have to do is decide what is important in that governance structure and make it achievable, and not fall into the trap of looking at what is achievable and making it important. And they're not the same thing at all. They can be the same thing, but they're not necessarily. And if we get to a situation where we just say this is what we're doing because it is possible, as opposed to this is what we are doing because it is important to do it this way, we will have problems downstream. So thank you, Chairman.
Merci beaucoup. Eh bien, si Madame Nair va bien, je vais passer.
Thank you very much. We'll now hear from the fourth actor that we've heard about a lot and has an important role to play, but will have to adapt. And I'll give you the floor, Madam, so that you can tell us about that.
I don't know if I'm the fourth actor or the third side of the triangle, but anyway, I would like to thank the organizers, because it is true it has become a regular rendezvous where we can take stock and reflect, and certainly if we are here today, it is also the reflection of the growing interest of the EU in space matters, and especially the Lisbon Treaty. And I would like to recall that we consider that it has been an excellent news for space, for Europe in space, and for citizens. For space, because it was the first time that space had appeared in an EU treaty as a policy in its own right and as an important subject. It has its own article. By the way, ESA was also referred to in the treaty, which we see as a recognition of our success and the work of the member states as well. It was good news for Europe in space because it provides political visibility and high-level attention, which was lacking in Europe, contrary to the major space powers. And it was good news for the citizens as well, because it meant that this new attention paid to space by the EU meant that space would be used as a tool for EU policies. The EU would federate the needs and use space as a tool for its policies. So all in all, we consider that all these rationales are still valid in the growing relation between ESA and the EU in space, and in the growing interest for space in the EU. And the three objectives are clearly: we want to address space at a higher political level, we want to widen the user base, and we want to ensure that space is fully used as a tool for EU policies. Now, this has been recalled by previous speakers. This relation between ESA and the EU does not date from the Lisbon Treaty. It has grown. Previous speakers have recalled the Framework Agreement, the Space Council, and the European Space Policy, which have been great successes on the institutional side. I want also to note the arrangement with EDA and the structured dialogue on space and security. So on the institutional side, we are well covered, so to speak. Now, on the programmatic side, of course, the cooperation has concentrated on the two flagship programs, Galileo and GMES. Other smaller-scale cooperations have been started, like IRIS, the SATCOM part of CESAR, or AIS, but let us concentrate on those two flagship programs. Of course, as any cooperation, it has been stepwise. It has been progressive. And I must say, if you look at the last 10 years, it has been quite pragmatic. We have tested several setups. We have tested several organizations, several ways to work together. So we can already say we have gathered some experience on how to work with the EU, and the EU has gathered as well quite an experience in how to work on space. So we have indeed seen that some general EU instruments with a system of calls for proposals, annual budgets, work plans are not fully optimal for space programs, which you all know require long-term commitments and technical supervision of the work being done by contractors. So we have some lessons learned, we can build on those, and we can also build on the fact that we know, and the EU now fully realizes, that space is a very specific sector. Yes, space is a unique tool. It provides global coverage, continuous monitoring, it provides ability to gather, transfer, disseminate large quantities of data, it is a means for innovation, it is a means for competitiveness, and also it benefits all citizens worldwide. So it makes space a very unique tool, but it is a fragile tool. And especially in Europe, if you look at the European space sector, unfortunately, Europe is the only space power which does not have a substantial security and defence space sector. So the European space industry must rely on the commercial market. It is unfortunately a fragility of the European space sector. It means that we have to have sustained investments, we have to have an appropriate industrial policy, we have to have a sound governance structure if we want to mitigate this fragility. Coming back to the exploitation, we have been talking about Galileo and GMES, and what is the need for the exploitation schemes for both Galileo and GMES? We need what we call a sustainable exploitation scheme. Now, in our view, this means a scheme which covers 4 key functions. First function is to federate the needs from the users and from the user communities and to provide these needs to the entity in charge of developing the system. Second function is to ensure sustainable and operational services and to guarantee their funding, because the goal, of course, is to secure the continuity of the services. This is a very important word. Third function is to deliver the services to the end users. And fourth function, to link with the entity in charge of development of R&D, to provide feedback from the users so as to prepare for the future and for the next generation of the infrastructure. Now, if you look at the highly successful case of meteorological satellites in Europe, you see that EUMETSAT, for instance, is the operator which now covers these 4 functions. Of course, at the beginning it was not the case. The responsibilities of EUMETSAT have evolved, and it is normal over the years that the functions should grow and evolve. But in any case, the 4 functions must be covered. The next challenge for us will be Galileo and GMES, and we must design the governance which will allow the 4 functions to be ensured. Now, for GMES, we consider that after the very successful launch, after the inclusion in the financial perspectives, Galileo is in good track. Of course, the challenge is now GMES. We must allow for the continuous provision of environmental services. We must strengthen Europe's position in environmental protection. GMES already equips Europe with a tool, already delivers services. We must preserve this tool. We must not interrupt the services. At this point in time, we are 2 years before the first launches of the Sentinel satellites. We consider there is no alternative for GMES but to ensure its exploitation in line with the responsibilities that have been agreed. What are those responsibilities? ESA, together with the member states working as the R&D agency responsible for the space component and preparing its future evolution, and the EU responsible for ensuring the exploitation of GMES and providing the related services in an operational manner. In my view, this will be our joint major challenge for the years to come. Hopefully, it will be our largest success as well, and I hope next year we will meet again and consider this success. Thank you.
Merci, Madame. Merci, Madame. Je voudrais passer la...
Thank you. To wind up on this initial round table, we are going to move on to our next speaker. You it would be very interesting to hear your view on the future.
Grazie, anche io vorrei associarmi al ringraziamento alla Business Bridge.
Thank you. Well, I too would like to start off by thanking Business Bridge for organising this conference and for having a session specifically on governance. As we've heard from others, this is now very topical, not just because of the EGNOS and Galileo programs, but also it's of importance to the agency that I represent, the GSA. Now, the Commission has made its proposal and has made significant funds available for EGNOS and Galileo under the next financial framework. And the second variable, apart from money, of course, is governance. And the current regulation, which is in the pipeline, which is currently being developed by the Commission, does identify governance as one of the main priorities, which is something we welcome. And the regulation puts the GSA at the center of the operational stage, where we are trying to develop services. And I would like to stress that it's important to tackle this issue head-on now. We shouldn't just say, oh, it's early days yet and we still have time, because for Galileo and EGNOS, there are deadlines which aren't all too far off, and we need to make sure that the necessary governance is in place, and it will take a couple of years to get it right, so we better get started straight away. EGNOS has a natural deadline, which is 2014, because that's the end of the contract for operations. For Galileo, the deadline is 2014-2015, because that's the initial operational capability. That's when Galileo is expected to start providing the first services. So as you can see, we don't have a great deal of time. With that, I'd now like to look at governance in a bit more detail. I'll look at it from the EGNOS point of view first, and then afterwards I'll address the Galileo angle. Now, the Commission, of course, will continue to play a very important role. They are the political and regulatory supervisors, as it were. But for the GSA, in this new organizational setup, we are to be in charge of programming, and we hope that that can be as flexible as possible, so that we can be as close as possible to industry. They will, of course, be very important for the operations, but also to make sure that there is integration of the land segment, the Earth segment, with the space segment. And of course, the European Space Agency has an important role to play as well, because they will have to manage the various versions of the system as it develops. So I do think there has to be close cooperation between the GSA and the ESA. And of course, we need to bear in mind that EGNOS is an operational system, and that therefore continuity of service has to be one of the main priorities, and needs to continue to be one of the main priorities. And we do, of course, need governance, but we don't want a revolution. We don't want to radically overhaul things. A further important point, which both EGNOS and Galileo have in common from our point of view in the GSA, is the fact that under the next research program, we need to be taken into account. That's where you can make sure that applications and services can be developed and can have new versions, can have updates. And that then establishes the bridge to the users and to the user community. So that's a role which needs to be developed further. Support will have to be given to that, and that again will be one of the priorities for the GSA. So there will be this important transition from a technology push system to a system which is user need based. Looking at Galileo then, I would first of all look at what already exists. Our efforts so far have been crowned with success, and that's our starting point if we look at the GSA's role for the future. And I would point to EUMETSAT. That has been operational quite successfully for a number of years. So I would like to establish an analogy as I see it, and then also point out the differences. First of all, when it comes to the governance structure, EUMETSAT is an intergovernmental body, so it's the responsibility of a number of member states, and there is therefore no equivalence with the 27 member states that you could have, but the principle is the same, so there is an analogy. The European Commission, which is currently on the governing board of GSA, will, by its presence, establish that natural bridge. But again, close cooperation with the ESA will be needed. ESA is responsible for the space segment and for developing the system further within EUMETSAT. Again, an analogy to what needs to be done for Galileo and EGNOS. But when it comes to the services, I do see a difference. EUMETSAT is geared towards a captive market, a captive audience, whereas we in the future will have to go for a more structured approach. There's a public side to what we do, but also a commercial side which will need to be developed. And a further difference I see with how we do things in the future and how we've done things in EUMETSAT is the Earth component. The Earth component under EUMETSAT is done by EUMETSAT itself, whereas under Galileo it might be farmed out privately or delegated privately, and that's a further difference. But I'll conclude by saying that in our view the GSA has a lot of ambitious challenges ahead. We will certainly need the support of member states, and we will need to have close cooperation with the Commission and the European Space Agency, but I'm sure that we will be able to be successful and build on the successes which have already been achieved. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur de Doride. Vous étiez venu en
Thank you, Mr. de Oride. You came in 2008, and a lot of water has flown under the bridge since then. So we've got 10 minutes left. Are there any questions from participants to our panel members? Any questions? Go ahead.
Peter Desalding with Space News. I have a question for Mr. Des Doride. If someone from the Commission has an idea, and the idea is that since you're doing Galileo so well, why don't you also do GMES? What's your response?
So I can tell you that indeed this is an option which is actually analyzed. Of course, there are some, let's say, advantages in this direction because of the close cooperation with the market. So, and also for the synergies which exist between the GNSS, let's say, world and the GMES one. But as we have heard, there are also other alternatives, other agencies which might provide as well other strength, other advantages. Maybe that here Mr. Weissenberg could also comment on this question.
Monsieur Warner, vous vouliez ajouter quelque chose?
Would you like to add anything, Mrs. Naya?
Yes, thank you. I want to mention a very important point. We discussed also about Lisbon Treaty always, and we are doing this since Lisbon Treaty was signed. But we have to clearly define that Lisbon Treaty does not give any exclusive rights to anybody. So the Lisbon Treaty defines a parallel competence. And if you look into the papers, you see that in the Convention of ESA as well in the Lisbon Treaty, space policy is mentioned as a topic. So we should not say now, after Lisbon Treaty, the Commission is everything or EU is everything. We have still this triangle which we had before, ESA, EU and Member States, and the coordination, to my opinion, is with the Space Council. That means with EU and ESA at the same time, just as a special remark to that point.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Any further questions? Perhaps to Mr. Weissenberg and Mrs. Naya. We've heard mention of coordination. We've heard mention about the responsibilities of those in charge of governance. We've heard that things will be changing, Mrs. Naya, as regards the legal framework for responsibility for the intergovernmental agreement or the community programs. Perhaps you'd like to say something about that, Mrs. Naya?
Oui, merci de cette question.
Thank you. As regards the operational systems, who will do what? Well, first of all, we have to see that we have the funding, the resources. Mr. Williams talked about reliability, and that is a key concept. There has to be somebody in charge, and they have to be accountable for the services. Now, whether the agency can work for intergovernmental programs, well, it's already the case. ESA works for different partners, so that's not really a problem. But the key issue is who is in charge, and that person should ensure that the resources are available.
Oui, merci. Moi, je suis très content.
Thank you. I'm very happy to have heard this discussion, because I think that we agree on a lot of issues, and that wasn't necessarily the case before. So that's progress. And coordination is a big word. We keep hearing that we need someone to coordinate, but that means you need someone who wants to coordinate. And of course the best thing to do is to throw money at it. If Parliament and Council give me $1 billion a year, then you'll find that coordination takes care of itself. Secondly then, you need to look at the legal status of a coordination system. Galileo, GMES as a regulation is something that might work in other areas as well. So coordination has a political dimension, and the result of our coordination will depend on the political willingness to be coordinated. It's as simple as that. And since yesterday, I've been noticing that we de facto agree on coordination. As I said yesterday, the real challenge does not lie within the European Union. The real challenge for Europe as a spatial power is global. So there is a real need to coordinate. And I'll address a further point, and I'm grateful to David Williams for having mentioned it. We need to separate the governance of the program from the governance of implementation. As Mrs. Naja has said, there is still work to do on the governance of programs, and the problem we have in Europe is to make sure that we can achieve synergies between the civil and the military side. We're the only space power, Europe as a whole is the only space power that does not achieve that synergy. We're working on it, the space situational awareness, Galileo, PAS, but it's very piecemeal, it's case by case, and it's certainly not a systemic approach along the lines of what the other space powers do. Then liability was mentioned. Well, I would say to the GSA, if you want to manage Galileo exploitation, then as the British say, you need to be fully accountable. And that means that the Commission needs to give them technical specifications. What are we in the Commission expecting from our agency when they manage Galileo? And coming up with those technical specifications is a major challenge, because it's also an opportunity to create synergies between Galileo and GMES. If we have an agency in place that takes care of exploitation for Galileo, it might take care of other things as well. And one last point on liability. The only way of achieving liability is to have a legislative act. Currently, for EGNOS, it's the Commission that shoulders the legal and political responsibility, and that's not normal. The Commission is a political body. We shouldn't be managing the program, EGNOS, so we're going to have a third-party liability regulation, and that will set out the quality of service that we want to achieve and what the benchmark is. And I'm very happy that we're now looking at security issues, defense issues, liability and accountability. I'm glad that we're moving on to that discussion, which is different from other years. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Najar. Thank you, sir. Maybe I could turn to Mr. Williams. Some concluding remarks?
The GSA and GMES. Of course, you can only delegate authority to the GSA if you have a budget to delegate. So I would encourage the Commission to put it back on budget, because without that we have a credibility problem in Europe about the importance of environment and climate within the European Union, the European Commission. We've spent many years trying to get the budget, and if we don't get one, I think we send a message not just back to my politicians, but to global politicians that Europe isn't really that worried about the environment and climate. And on the security side, I think it is important, and I think it's only when we are confident that the data will be handled sensibly in the European concept that we'll move away from what I call a multilateral approach to space situational awareness through perhaps an organisation like the EDA than directly through Commission funding. So I think that's an important issue as well.
Merci, Monsieur Williams. Avec vous, nous
Thank you, Mr. Williams. With that, we will conclude this session. We have a coffee break now. It's one floor down. Please make it a brief coffee break, because afterwards we have another lengthy and lively session. So I'll see you soon.
Et bien entendu, je remercie tous les orateurs.
And of course, I'd like to thank all of the panelists.
Já také děkuji České kabině.
Oui, allez.